Now, colour and colour space is a huge topic. sRGB, Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB. So for editing, printing, sending to someone or sharing on the web, for the what, why and when, I'll answer that in this video. Now, when it comes to colour and colour space, I'll admit I am no Dan Margulis. But I absolutely understand and know what to use and when to use it so that I get the very best results possible when editing, printing, sharing images on the web or sending images to somebody else. So let's kick off with colour space and then we'll move on to displays and then finally how this all ties in when it comes to printing. Now, sRGB is the smallest of the three colour spaces and it's generally thought of as the colour space for the web. However, that said, it is the colour space used by a lot of pro printing labs that you'll send your images to for printing. sRGB is considered a safe colour space because it remains consistent throughout the whole process. Capture if you're shooting in JPEG, what you see on your display, editing, printing and sharing on the web. It looks and will remain consistent throughout each and every one. Adobe RGB is a larger colour space than sRGB, approximately 35% larger, and so contains a larger range of red, green and blue values. Now this is an interesting one, especially if you share an Adobe RGB image straight onto the web, and I'll explain why in a minute. ProPhoto is the largest colour space of the three, so large in fact that it has what is often referred to as imaginary colours. Colours we can't actually differentiate because the difference is so incredibly small. But when using it, we do have to use a larger bit depth. Now let me just explain something about colour space that will make total sense. An 8-bit image, regardless of the colour space it is in, contains 16.8 million red, green and blue values. 256 shades of red, 256 shades of green and 256 shades of blue. 256 multiplied by 256 multiplied by 256 gives 16.8 million red, green and blue values. Now, even though sRGB is smaller than Adobe RGB and Adobe RGB is smaller than ProPhoto RGB, they all have the exact same amount of colours, 16.8 million. One doesn't have more or less than the other. However, what this means is that Adobe RGB has a wider range of the same amount of colours than sRGB, and ProPhoto has a wider range of the same amount of colours than sRGB and Adobe RGB. Now, to simplify this, think of having 3 containers, and in each of those 3 containers are 3 colours, red, green and blue. sRGB has its own container and everything fits in perfectly. Adobe RGB, although having the same colours, has a bigger range and so it needs a bigger container. And for that bigger range of colours to fit in the container, they need to theoretically spread themselves out. ProPhoto would need an even bigger container, and because it has an even wider range of colour, it would need to spread even more to fill it. Now, because these 16.8 million colours are in theory having to spread further, this is why bit depth is so important. Spreading the 16.8 million values of red, green and blue can produce banding in larger colour spaces such as ProPhoto RGB. So to avoid this, rather than working in 8-bit, working in a higher bit depth like 16-bit gives a whopping 281 trillion red, green and blue values. Now, like I said, much of this the human eye can't even differentiate. However, what this really shows is that having those 281 trillion colour values in the ProPhoto RGB colour space and in 16-bit means we're getting way more colour information, which means much more quality and less likelihood of any banding. With that out of the way, now let's talk about our displays and then move on to printing and what we think is the ultimate goal of having what we see on our display matching exactly what comes out of our printers. Now, most photographers use displays that are closer to sRGB. You'll see it in the technical specifications that it says something like 100% Adobe sRGB. There are also wider gamut displays that closer resemble Adobe RGB. So what does this mean? Well, working in ProPhoto RGB is clearly the best workspace because it has a wider range of red, green and blue values. But depending on your display, you're either seeing the images in sRGB or, in the case of a wider gamut display, Adobe RGB. This is really important to understand because we can become obsessed with wanting our prints to match our display. But you're working in ProPhoto, you're looking at an sRGB or maybe an Adobe RGB image on your display, but a lot of printers are capable of printing certainly outside of sRGB and more outside of the Adobe RGB gamut. So if that is the case, how can a print exactly match what's on the display? Now, if this is what you want, where what you see on your screen perfectly matches what comes off your printer, as near as damn it, because bearing in mind now displays are backlit, but if this is what you want, the only way to safeguard it is by converting the image to sRGB before printing. However, doing this does risk clipping or losing colour detail that your printer could potentially have printed. But that said, all of the prints displayed at my first ever exhibition, which were printed at 24 inches on the long edge and all converted to sRGB for the lab to print, looked amazing. Colour, contrast, brightness, absolutely bang on. So the choice is yours. Use a safe colour space like sRGB so that what you have on your display matches what comes off the printer as much as it possibly can, or maximise colour information and maximise quality and limit the risk of any kind of banding or other issues by using a larger colour space. The difference in most cases may be minute, barely if at all noticeable, but it's just something to think about and maybe test. And when it comes to me sending images to other people, I will always send them in Adobe sRGB so that they will be nice and safe and remain consistent whether they look at them on their mobile device, upload them to the web, or do a print. Okay, so this video was published on Friday the 30th of September 2022, which means you have just 2 days left to grab a free pass for the Lightroom Virtual Summit, which starts on Monday the 3rd of October. You can grab your free pass using the link in the description or in the comments. Alright, as always, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, click on that subscribe button because that's just a great free way that you can support this channel. But for now, that's me, I'm done. I'll see you in the next video.